Coming up, tribal nations with ancestral homelands in Colorado are reclaiming the name of a significant mountain. Plus, we check in with a Kansas State University professor honored for his work on behalf of Native students. Plus, an interview with author Virginia Driving Hawk Sneve. Join us for those interviews, plus headlines on the ICT Newscast.
This program is made possible by the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, a private corporation funded by the American people.
The ICT Newscast is sponsored by the Indian Land Tenure Foundation, a nonprofit organization serving American Indian nations and people in the recovery and control of their rightful homelands. On the web at iltf.org.
Support for the ICT Newscast with Aaliyah Chavez comes from the Arizona PBS studios in Phoenix at the Walter Cronkite School of Journalism and Mass Communications at Arizona State University.
Chinangale, we're so glad you could join us. I'm Mackenzie Allen Charmley. Aaliyah is away. We begin today in California, where the state's governor has signed 2 laws hoping to prompt California State University schools to return Native American remains and artifacts. ICT previously brought you reporting on the audit completed by the state, which found that CSU campuses had collectively failed to return nearly 700,000 Indigenous objects. In August, state lawmakers pressed school officials at a joint oversight hearing about why the items had not been previously returned, even after federal and state laws require it. Many of them said it was because they lacked dedicated funding and staff. As of last week, California Governor Gavin Newsom has made it a law for CSU schools to give progress reports every year on their efforts. Many Native leaders have long criticized the slow movement by CSU schools, including State Assembly member James Ramos, who authored the bills. The repatriation proposals were just 2 out of hundreds of bills lawmakers sent to Newsom's desk this year. Now to Argentina, where Indigenous people are challenging proposed lithium mining. Indigenous people in Jujuy are worried that their way of life will be disrupted by lithium mining extraction, which requires massive amounts of water and chemicals. Lithium is a key element in the production of batteries, and demand is rapidly growing as vehicles and power plants convert away from fossil fuels. Activists say part of the problem is that Indigenous ownership of land is based on rights that may not be recorded in writing. Residents say that lithium mining will pollute the soil and water, risking the health of people and animals. One local resident, Nati Machaca, told the BBC that if this goes on, we will soon starve and become ill. Currently, there are 38 lithium mines operating in the area where much of the world's production occurs. And those are the headlines for the ICT Newscast. There are many mountain peaks visible from Denver, Colorado. One of them is Mount Blue Sky. It was previously named Mount Evans after Colorado's territorial governor. Evans is sometimes referred to as the architect of the 1864 Sand Creek Massacre, where around 230 Cheyenne and Arapaho people, including women, children, and elders, were killed by the American military. In September, the Department of the Interior announced the name Mount Evans was out and Mount Blue Sky would start being used immediately. Journalists Darren Brown, and Adam Youngbear from Cheyenne and Arapaho Productions attended the peak's renaming ceremony. They were able to capture the reaction of Cheyenne and Arapaho people who had been driven out of their ancestral homelands years ago.
The Shirapo people are deeply rooted in Colorado. Our history is here. We have ceremonial sites here. Our culture was here. It's a really beautiful place. And like I said, you take away all the buildings and you see it for what it was. And unfortunately, things happened. And I kind of felt, as most people do, we were run out. Most everybody in the room knows that Governor Evans was very instrumental in the 1864 Sand Creek Massacre. Well, not only was he instrumental in the massacre, but he was also instrumental in the proclamation that allowed for, I think as it was in that proclamation, that Indians could be killed at any time, any place, anywhere. We can't change those things, but you know what? We came back, 100 years or so and changed the name. And if there's something that we can do in our lifetimes, it's kind of make things right, settle things the way they should have been, and to hopefully that this allows people, our tribal members, to heal.
This is beautiful land, as Governor Sneve said. Very beautiful land. But I'm going to tell you something. It's cold up there. It's cold and it's rough up there. You know, it's hard to breathe up there. But my grandson, he helped me, and I made Paul Sonderman's here somewhere. I once made you have to watch, because when you're Rapo, what you say becomes a vow. So you got to do what you say. And I was being funny, and I told him, I said, when this name gets changed, I'm going to sing a victory song on top of that mountain. So he held me to it, And so today I was up there and breathing it, and thank God for my grandson. He helped me sing that song. So I did get it done.
The winds up here on the summit can be quite strong and pretty powerful, but it was those winds who carried this victory song all across this place this morning that used to be known as Mount Everest. This morning, the Cheyenne and Arapaho tribes came to reclaim this mountain as their own. And now forever, this place will be known to not just the Cheyenne and Arapaho people, but to everyone as Mount Blue Sky.
This morning was a one-of-a-kind feeling, We got to change the name in our way, the way we do it. I thought back to, how our people roamed this area, this was home, and we changed it to Blue Sky, and people say, why? That's the opening for our educational portion, This is why we named it.
I thought I was an aware person. I thought I knew a lot of this history, and I didn't know how much I didn't know until some people said they wanted to change the name, and I had to study and see why they wanted to change the name. And the more I saw, the more outraged I became at the history, and what we were taught was history that was not. That the history had never actually been written, and that it's only through this name change that we're finally getting the history written in a way that's accessible to everyone, that we can all learn.
It took a lot of effort from every aspect of the people that live here in Colorado, and they helped us. They understand what our story was, and they helped us push through and push through and push through and push through. And today it's a reality, that we have our foot back in the door, on our land. Come back home. Yeah.
We send a special thank you to our friends at Cheyenne and Arapaho Productions for that reporting. We turn now to Kansas, where our university professor wants a better educational environment for Native students and faculty. ICT's Stuart Huntington checked in with Alex Redcorn for this reporting.
Osage Nation University professor Alex Redcorn is focused on improving the educational landscape for Native students in Kansas. He's lobbied to rid state schools of offensive mascots and worked to raise the profile of Indigenous faculty members at Kansas State University, where he's an assistant professor of educational leadership. His work earned him a high honor this year. He won the Wilma Mankiller Memorial Award for Civil Rights from the National Education Association. I visited with Professor Redcorn and asked him about his work and Native educational sovereignty.
One of the things that I think a lot of people don't realize is that over the histories of removal and processes of weaponizing education systems to be used against American Indians, through that process, a lot of Native kids ended up in public schools. And so there was this big transition between the federal Indian boarding schools of the past, but over time, a lot of programs and policies started moving Native kids into public schools. So now we operate in an environment where over 90% of our American Indian kids are actually under the responsibility of the state systems and the state and local education systems, so school districts and state systems. And our tribal governments don't often have an administrative role or oversight role to be involved in the education of their own people. And so a lot of the work I try to do is to reposition that and think, how can we actually build capacities for Native nations to have a more prominent role in the education of their own people, because they have an inherent sovereign right to be involved in the education of their own people and influence the education of their own people. And so that's where I tend to focus a lot of my work, is program building and systems thinking around those types of topics.
Have you had success with Native nations within the state of Kansas?
We had recent success. And so we've been doing a lot of community building over the last several years in Kansas. And so what we started to notice was that there's just a lot of people in a lot of different systems that aren't necessarily talking to one another. And so it always starts with relationship building. So we spent several years just building community and building relationships across our systems, tribal governments, school systems, the state education systems at the higher ed level, as well as the K through 12 level. Apologies. And so we started doing that work, and we just did community building for several years. And just over the last year and a half, we've started the Kansas Advisory Council for Indigenous Education Working Group. And that brings together representatives from the tribal governments, as well as Kansas State Department of Education, Kansas State Board of Education, Kansas Board of Regents, as well as some other community members as well. So we've turned that relationship building into collaboration and a lot of advisory and communication going on across the governments to figure out how we can improve our educational systems for, about, and with Native Americans.
That sounds very positive. And you've been getting some good responses within the state systems?
Yeah, so within these conversations, it's really been about learning about one another and about those systems, because there's a lot of technical jargon, there's a lot of background information. When somebody from a tribal government is starting to work with the State Department of Education, there's learning that goes both ways. And so right now we've been doing a lot of learning and a lot of listening to one another, and we've issued several advisory statements on topics like improving student data systems, moving from American Indian mascots, and improving our curricular infrastructures and things like that. But at this point, it's all advisory statements, and we really only started recently turning those into actionable items.
And does your work also focus on improving the teaching about Indigenous communities for the broader student population?
Yes, and so it's not, I often use the phrase that we need to improve our educational systems for, about, and with Native Americans. Quite often we think of Indians in education as, oh, we need to put them in the curriculum and we need to learn about these natives. And our curricular infrastructures are really out of date. And we're aware of that in Kansas, and Kansas State Department of Education is trying to fix that. However, nationwide, there's this really pernicious status quo where American Indians just kind of ceased to exist past 1900. And so what we've been doing is we've been doing a lot of professional development and outreach work with teacher workshops, and any time we can get an opportunity to visit with a school and their teachers to discuss these core issues and how they can start going about changing those status quos in their systems, we've been doing that. But what we're also doing, so that's when we're teaching about Native Americans, but then when we talk about teaching for Native Americans, we help them recognize that American Indians are in their classrooms, and not all of them look like the stereotypes they think American Indians look like. And so they're in their classrooms. So we're improving these systems for these kids, because there are American Indians that are enrolled in almost every single school district in the state of Kansas. And so we're trying to improve that by working with these teachers and working with these leaders. But we're also, a really important layer is we're trying to do it with our native nations. There are 4 federally recognized tribes in Kansas, and there are several tribes in Oklahoma and elsewhere that have connections to Kansas, or they have students in Kansas. So it's really important to think, how can we work with these communities and with these native nations to collaboratively come up with solutions to improve these situations and to improve our learning environments about, for, and with natives in Kansas.
And sir, you mentioned that you also do some work on mascots. Is that an issue in Kansas?
Yeah, it's an issue in Kansas. It's an issue all over the country, and it's really kind of a pernicious thing that doesn't seem to want to move in some ways. But in Kansas, we've had some success in recent years where, when communities have taken the time to actually engage in community conversations and actually learn about the layers of the mascot conversation and not just halt the conversation at somebody's not offended, so we're going to move on. And so the communities that really engage in the community dialogue and community conversation, they found success over time where people started to truly understand how mascots are an extension of the learning environment. And when you look at what the research says about mascots, where they're harmful for kids, not only native kids, but for all kids, once people dive into that research and then they actually do a certain thing and they start looking at their actual policies, and they start looking at their diversity policies and their anti-bullying policies, and they start looking at their own policies from their own boards and within their own schools, and they start to recognize that some of those mascots are actually in violation of their own policies, their own strategic plans, their own goals. And so when they start to notice that dissonance between what they're saying they're doing in schools and what they expect out of their student body and expect out of their teachers, they start to recognize that the mascot is actually in violation of their own policies in some ways. So actually in Kansas, there are 3 to 4 school districts that have actually changed in recent years. So there's progress in Kansas, but there's still a lot of community conversations to be had.
Professor Alex Redcorn, thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
Redcorn works across the state and beyond, but also in his own backyard. The high school in Kansas State's hometown, Manhattan, has a mascot that Native leaders say needs changing. Through the work of organizations like the National Native American Boarding School Healing Coalition, the stories of boarding schools, trauma, and reconciliation have been featured many times here on the ICT Newscast. Well, ICT Shirley Sneve brings us a new perspective, and that is from her mother. She spoke with Virginia Driving Hawk Sneve, who is a longtime author, about her own boarding school experience. Let's take a look.
My mother is an author of several books, fiction and nonfiction. In 1933, Virginia Driving Hawk was born on the Rosebud Reservation in South Dakota. We sat down this summer to talk about her youth. She attended boarding school during the World War II era.
At St. Mary's, that was during World War II, and we had teachers that were coming from, mainly from New England places. And we had this Japanese teacher that came to be with us. And I didn't think much about her. I mean, she didn't look much differently than the Indian students we had. And she was, and I didn't have her for a class because I think she taught the advanced English classes, and I wasn't ready for that yet. But we had an all-school assembly, and she was explaining about how she came to be at St. Mary's. Her family were in California, and she had gone to school in the East, and I don't remember the college where it was, but she had been sponsored by an Episcopal congregation. And then after her parents were interned, they were taken from their homes and placed in these camps in Nevada, and because they were worried about them being espionage and spies that close to Japan. The congregation in the East did not want her going back to those internment camps. So some pulled some strings some way or other and said that they would be responsible for her. And so they managed to find her this teaching position in the interior of the United States where things would be all safe for her and no spies, that sort of thing. And I remember being so appalled about how can we treat people like that, just take them away from their homes and then move them to strange places, and she wouldn't be able to go home. And I expressed that to her. I said, oh, that's just terrible that you had to be treated like that. And she looked at me and she said, what do you think reservations are? And of course, I suppose I was about 12 years old, and something like that never even occurred to me what it was. And it's kind of sparked my curiosity so that I became more aware of what my tribal life had been like, and sparked my curiosity to explore that later as I got older and became a writer.
Tell us about your education and how you grew up and where you went to school.
I liked school very much. It was fun to be around other kids. And then we moved to Oak Creek, South Dakota, and I was in the 3rd grade then and started school there. And I was very fortunate to have a teacher that appreciated that I learned to read very quickly, and I loved to read. And he would give me books from his private library and everything, and I just assumed everybody had books like that. I didn't realize that. And then after the 3rd grade, I stayed in Oak Creek until I was ready for the 6th grade. And then my parents decided I should go to boarding school. And this was usually what happened to children on the reservation. If they wanted more education, they had to go to a boarding school. Well, my parents decided that the Rosebud boarding school, that's where they went. And they had some unfortunate experiences there in not being able to speak the language and other things. And they didn't think I would get the education that I should have. So they sent me to St. Mary's School for Indian Girls, which is at Springfield, South Dakota. And I went there when I was in the 6th grade and stayed until I graduated from high school. And it was a school that later became considered a prep school because we were being prepared for further education, whether it be college or to do something in some sort of an occupation that would require further training.
What was your experience like at boarding school?
I was very homesick. The first, I don't know, seemed like forever. And we slept in dormitories. I was used to having my own bed and sort of privacy. And but the one thing, there was running water and toilets. We didn't have to go outside like we did at home. So that was a plus. But I was very homesick, and I was very lonely and shy. And then the school had a system that they called Big Sisters. So an older student would be assigned to a newer, younger student and would help them, get through the maze of what was expected of you and the chores you had to do and making your bed and all of these different things, which did help because somebody was keeping an eye on you. So, and then when the classes started, that was fine because I really liked school, enjoyed that.
When we're talking about all the abuse of boarding schools, how about your relatives? Did anybody?
Well, my parents, that generation, are the ones that experienced that kind of trauma or might have. My dad did not speak English when he started school, and so they were forbidden to use the language in the classroom, and it was very difficult a way to start to learn. And he and a friend of his, Noah Broken Leg, would sneak out and go hide behind the barn so they could talk Lakota to each other and kind of explain to understand what was going on at the school. They never experienced any physical abuse, but they saw friends of theirs that did, who were often supposedly got into trouble for some reason or other, and then they would be physically beaten. But they never were. My dad said we were good boys. My mother, on the other hand, went there, but she did not speak Lakota fluently. It was not her first language because her family had English. And so she had the experience of being teased by the other students as trying to be a white person because she wouldn't speak Lakota.
in your career, you became an educator.
We didn't have much choices. At least I didn't realize it at the time. If you wanted to go on to do something after high school, it was either being a teacher or a nurse. Well, I had no desire to be around sick people or whatever. And so that was all that was left for me to do, was be a teacher. And I got to many years later, after I found out that there were such things as women who were lawyers, I thought, I could have been a lawyer. I like to read, not necessarily a trial lawyer, but something like that. And I always kind of regretted that I never had that opportunity to look at that. And not many of us did at that age, at least Indian girls.
With my mother, Virginia Driving Hawk Sneve, in the Black Hills, Shirley Snavy, ICT News.
And that's a slice of our Indigenous world. For all the latest, visit ictnews.org. From all of us in the newsroom, stay safe, my relatives.
This program is made possible by the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, a private corporation funded by the American people. This program is made possible by the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, a private corporation funded by the American people.